All right, so officially welcoming everybody to the final talk in our spring climate mobility speaker series. You probably know me by now. I'm Simona Capisani, assistant professor of environmental philosophy here at Durham University in the UK. Annie Stilts, my colleague who has been helping to run the group, our research group in the series, sends her apologies. She's been unable to make it last minute today, but she is looking forward, Carol, to seeing your talk. So I wanted to thank everybody for coming to the series. I wanted to also make a note that if you missed any of the last talks, I'll put the note in the chat, but we have all of them recorded and they'll be available. And I'll also be making available our Climate Mobilities Working Research Group's website eventually. So if you do want to get on the working group's email list or want to get more involved, we have some exciting things coming down the pipeline, including hopefully a large conference next spring that Princeton is generously going to be hosting, where we hope to bring an eclectic group of researchers, community organizers, policymakers, media folks there to really try to work on a kind of bottom-up research approach to a lot of the questions that have emerged here. So really looking forward to that. Without further delay, I am very, very excited that Carol Farbotko could actually be with us today, even though it is past midnight her time, zooming in. So we're all very gracious and grateful for this talk that is coming at an odd time for her. But Carol is, if you already don't know her, although many of us here are following in your footsteps of your work, is currently a cultural geographer at Griffith University, who's interested in place, culture, politics, has written a tremendous amount on mobility, looking at that in the context of climate change with a particular focus on Oceania, and is also done a tremendous amount of work and is continuing to examine Indigenous solutions to global challenges, and including a wide range of considerations about the full mobility spectrum, including immobility, which is something that's been coming up a lot for us, and we find to be very important to get that full heterogeneity of the phenomena under examination and in the context of our research. So Carol, I want to turn the mic over to you. You're welcome to start sharing your screen. It could take about 40 minutes or so. If you need longer, if you end up shorter, it's okay. And then I'll lead off with the questions. We'll open up to Q&A. So with that, take it away.
Thank you so much. It's really good to be here. Just sort of noting that because it is the middle of the night, and also it's quite cold here in the Southern Hemisphere at the moment, where I am anyway, in Queensland, my voice might be a bit weak, or I might start coughing or something. It seems like that night air is a bit aggravating me. So if I start to sound incoherent, just someone say something and I'll try and take a drink or whatever. But thank you so much. It's really nice to be here. So thanks for the introduction. Yes, I do a lot of work on climate mobilities, and a lot of it is on climate mobilities as contested political narratives, I guess, rather than sort of on the ground kind of migration type research. So I'm really interested in how climate mobility narratives shape things like climate adaptation, migration policy, activism and research even, and most importantly, I guess, the lives of people who are climate vulnerable. So it's not at all novel to observe that, sorry, I'm just trying to figure out how to progress my slides.
You might need to say to not show speaker view, and then you can kind of click and progress on your screen.
Sorry, I'm not used to Zoom these days. I'm more of a Teams person. So how do I do that?
If anyone else wants to jump in, but if you're looking at your PowerPoint, usually there's like 3 dots where you can look at the different viewing, and you could say close presenter view, and then you're able to kind of see us and see your slideshow, and you should be able to just click on it and then progress with like your arrows on your keyboard. But if anyone else
I can see the 3 dots, but I don't see close presenter view. Sorry.
That's all right.
Very technologically inept.
You could also have it just showing on as the slide deck if that's easier for you, and then
Yeah, maybe that's easier.
worst case.
Yeah.
But if anyone else in the group has any
Please feel free
advice,
to
jump on.
Okay. So it's not novel at all to observe that alarmist narratives about climate mobility are problematic. But I think it's less common to approach these sort of narratives as important topics of study in their own right, and also even less common to look into alternatives. So the Pacific Islands region, as I'm sure you're all very aware, was long thought to be the likely origin of the world's first climate refugees. And this type of narrative over the last few decades now has performed all sorts of political work for external environmentalists, international policymakers, and other people from, I guess, outside the region often, who think about climate-related displacement as this kind of big problem, potential problem. But I would like to point out, to start off with, that when people from the Pacific, and that is quite common across activism, citizens, and political leaders alike, when they say that their islands need help to be saved from climate change, it is the whole of their ancestral places, the intricately connected land and sea environment and the people that they are referring to. So they are almost never asking to be saved as displaced people. And I think this is often a misinterpretation. So people in the Pacific Islands, I'd also like to point out, typically have long been aware of things like racist fear-mongering against migrants that happens sometimes in the global north, and they are aware of the violence that can be justified in the name of border protection, even just in our region. Of course, they listen to the news, and they have done for a long time. So it's not surprising to me that many people in small island states like Tuvalu, when discussing climate change risks, say things like, I don't want to be a slave elsewhere, I want to stay here. And this is partly because they're attached to their own land and communities, but also partly because they are tuned into global migration politics. So this sort of like relationality between, what people are doing in terms of climate mobility and what they hear about climate mobility is very much interconnected. So today I'll try and unpack some of the narratives that still persist in relation to the Pacific Islands that I think still fail to capture the agency and values of Pacific Island people, and to consider some alternatives. And there really is a wealth of Indigenous scholarship, activism and policy innovation that is occurring in the Pacific in response to climate change that firmly rejects the kind of standard dystopian narrative and is reclaiming Pacific climate futures. So,
and Carol, if you do want to make your slides a little bigger, there's some recommendations in the chat, but you could click the little podium sign or kind of scroll so folks can see it a little more. I don't know if you scroll all the way to the bottom. I didn't want to interrupt you, but as you're changing slides,
that's good.
There's like a little presenter stand that you could click on the bottom of the whole screen. It's on the left of the minus symbol, the bottom right. There you go.
Oh, hang on. Yeah. I think I've remembered how to do this. Okay, I can move through now.
There you are. Yep, all set.
Awesome.
Teamwork here.
Thank you. So it must be the late night. I'm just, struggling, obviously. The whole idea of PowerPoint, which I've only been using for 20 years. Okay, so
you're all good.
So I'm a cultural geographer. And since about 2004, I have been studying how ideas about Pacific and climate change take shape and circulate, and the power that they have. So I do most of my empirical research in the small nation state of Tuvalu, which has approximately 11,000 people. And this population has been acutely aware of the risk of possible forced displacement due to climate change for obviously several decades now. And indeed, there are children who have been born into it who are now young adults who've never known anything different. Right? So much has happened on the islands of Tuvalu for the last 30 years or so since this narrative first arrived. But what has not happened is either a mass exodus or a political crisis. And this might seem to be something of a non-finding, but I think it's actually quite significant. And I'm not alone. A recent paper by Climate Mobilities colleagues at the University of Melbourne did a systematic review of the literature and came to the conclusion that there is no evidence yet of climate change and migration, climate change causing migration from atolls. So, a bit of a personal note, I am a collaborator with a Tuvaluan activist, diaspora leader and Indigenous knowledge holder named Talkia Kitara, who is my husband. And I'm now also a Tuvaluan citizen, in addition to being Australian. So I kind of not really an insider and I'm not really an outsider, but I aim for my research to be that of an empathetic observer of Tuvaluan society. So I must also acknowledge that my research, especially in the last 8 years or so, has been a shared ongoing journey with Talkia. And we have also learned a lot from my late mother-in-law, Sitan Kitara, and our daughter, Mariseta Kitara, and many other family members and friends. But we seek to maintain the highest possible standards of ethical human research while observing and respecting Tuvaluan cultural protocols. But to some extent, my work is informed by my own kind of, I guess, positionality as a kind of part of a Tuvaluan family. So Tuvaluan families, including our own, are factoring climate change into decision-making about where we live. But this is not because of an immediate need to move away from the physical impacts of climate change, rather it is with a strong awareness of climate risk. So international migration is these days often seen as a way of hedging against future possibilities, such as through gaining dual citizenship for one's children. But aside from this, migration is occurring much as it always has. People still move to the capital from the outer islands and to places like New Zealand, Fiji, Taiwan, Australia, and other places for education and economic opportunities. So in my work, I've always sort of believed that it's important to understand how Tuvaluan people living with this threat of their home becoming uninhabitable experience changing relations to place and to other people, which is broader, I think, than focusing on climate mobilities alone. And I don't really focus on climate mobilities, even though I'm seen as a climate mobilities researcher. So taking a look now at what is now being called by several Pacific researchers in the Pacific region, this inevitable uninhabitability narrative, which is a ridiculous mouthful, but it's kind of important. And I'm sure most of you are aware that this exists in relation to the Pacific Atoll states, not only of Tuvalu, but also Kiribati and the Marshall Islands. So the type of description that we see on this slide is quite common, typically attempting to put a time frame on atolls becoming completely uninhabitable. And the language can differ in terms of how much certainty, and the time frames can also differ. So it clearly depends on what scenarios are being used. But the overall expectation is clear that atolls are seen to face a very dramatic future and that they are seen to be unable to support human life at some point. But I think it pays to note here that the science is quite wide-ranging, and it's different, produces very different types of narrative depending on what perspectives and assumptions are brought to bear on the issues. So this was a study published by John Barnett and colleagues. John Barnett is kind of a leading global expert on adaptation and specialises in atolls and has been studying them longer than I have. So probably coming up to 30 years, maybe. So and lots of on the ground work, and he really gets the climate science, and he also gets the social science, and he really knows the challenges and opportunities of adaptation when it comes to atolls and climate change. So he says, based on the available evidence, there seems to be no limit and few barriers to engineering urban islands on atolls such that they remain habitable well beyond this century. Rural atolls he sees as a different kind of challenge, but they should also be sustainable well beyond 2050, assuming continued emissions reductions and commitment to adaptation. And he also notes that the capacity of atoll peoples to adapt is far too heavily seen as a big problem in much of the literature, and he thinks it's actually, people are actually quite adaptive. So, and I'm not trying to question this, the sort of general severe risk of climate impacts on atolls, and I'm certainly not a climate scientist. But I think this sort of narrative where this perceived outcome of uninhabitability is repeated over and over again, so the sheer volume of it in comparison to alternatives, and its sort of newsworthiness has started to devalue other climate adaptation narratives or other climate mobility narratives, particularly those arising within atolls themselves. So this particular study critiques the idea of inevitable uninhabitability in the context of Kiribati, pointing out that people are connected to their land and don't want to move, and that the government of Kiribati is tackling the narrative head on by trying to position Kiribati as a place of positive transformation and development in a changing climate. So on the one hand, this, the narrative of inevitable uninhabitability, sorry, the mouthful, can seem on the surface to be about saving the victims of climate change from sea level rise. And I think that's something that we're all very familiar with. But it can also be a convenient code for colonialist and racist ideas about whether Indigenous people from the atolls can or even should remain on their own islands. And this has been really addressed by Kiribati scholar Tirinaki Tanyelo, who argues that the narrative risks generating a discourse of defeatism that insidiously undermines the permanent sovereignty of people over their natural resources, and through this, the right of people to self-determination. So another way of seeing the uninhabitability narrative as an example of climate change colonialism is pointed out by Tuvaluan Indigenous scholars Tafuila Sama and Taukia Kitara, because they see it as the global north dictating what is best for the global south through domination of ideas about likely climate futures. So, and this has actually been sort of transformed into, proposed policy solutions from outside, one of which assumed that people would be leaving the atolls en masse, would happily exchange Australian citizenship for Tuvalu's extensive exclusive economic zone, so their marine territory. So Australia would gain that in return for granting citizenship rights in Australia to Tuvaluans. And at the time, the Prime Minister of Tuvalu was Aneli Sopoaga, and he very publicly condemned this solution as colonialist, taking the same kind of line that, the self-determination wasn't even taken into account, and that, the Tuvaluans were ready to give up their entire territory just for some citizenship rights. So, it seems that this, this narrative of inevitable uninhabitability has taken on a kind of truth value, that is far removed from on the ground kind of realities, but I guess perversely can kind of shape that reality. So there was a really good study done by, I think I've gone too far, sorry, this slide, a really good study done in the context of the Marshall Islands, where it was shown that, you know, donors and external kind of development people in the Marshalls very much saw this, you know, the inevitable uninhabitability that Marshalls was going to be ready to pack up and leave very soon. So what was the point in investing in major development and adaptation projects there? So back in Tuvalu, you know, what's been going on the ground, political leaders, civil society and climate activists alike have for decades, you know, together lobbied for global emissions reductions and in situ adaptation measures. And although Tuvalu and other atoll states have limited resources to fund large-scale physical adaptation, it hasn't stopped them from proposing and planning such projects, such as big land reclamation projects. So that's happening in Tuvalu at the moment. Some of the land reclamation has already started, as you can see in these photos, and others are sort of in progress at the moment. But this inevitable uninhabitability narrative, we think, risks preemptively depicting these kind of efforts as naive or futile and prevent them from serious review to determine feasibility and, you know, from things like attracting good expertise. And what worries me quite a lot is that because relocation at a smaller scale, like at a community scale, has long been used as a tool to remove certain populations from areas, you know, to make way for new developments, such as people of insecure tenure. People have been moved on relatively easily. Who is to say that a small nation without extensive financial resources will also be pressured to move on to make way for larger geopolitical interests, such as those seeking control of their exclusive economic zones, and which is clearly of interest to countries like Australia. So I think that those of us in climate mobility should be paying attention to, you know, these kind of, potentially these kind of answers. And I hope it's not something that's been sort of seriously considered, but yeah, given the sort of commitment to, you know, ideas about these countries being very soon to be uninhabitable, you know, what is being planned for that space, that especially that marine space, once these islands are supposedly depopulated. So clearly habitability narratives are not just a matter for science, they're not objective and power free. And I see that, you know, when this most extreme version of climate risk for atolls is repeated over and over again, it just becomes another risk for climate vulnerable populations on the atolls to manage and bear. So, but they should have the right to lead the narrative, not be burdened by it. So studying everyday life in Tuvalu, as well as kind of policy, I have definitely observed non-dystopian futures being imagined and brought into being through the practices of Tuvaluan people, as well as government. So I've seen the important role of Tuvaluan Indigenous placemaking as part of the social and cultural response to challenges such as the COVID-19 pandemic. So the will and desire for there to be a continuing population of Tuvalu is very clear. And I have described this as voluntary immobility, because I needed a term that would capture the agency and active choices being made to stay, that political responses at various scales to persistent narratives of uninhabitability. And I've also introduced the idea of re-emplacement to try and find a better way to describe how people in Tuvalu are actively remaking homes and places in situ as a combined material and political process that is more than simply adaptation. It is an assertion of place-based rights, identity and sovereignty. So I now just discuss a few examples of voluntary immobility in policy and activism and everyday life. So first up, the Tuvalu government's sort of most recent policies that, you know, show their thinking. I mean, there is a pathways approach that does take the kind of worst case scenario of relocation very seriously. And there's planning for multiple scenarios, but focusing most particularly on the future in which the adaptation is successful and the islands will remain populated. So there's always been a distinct lack of agitation for international climate migration rights, for instance. But what is being expected from international partners is that adaptation assistance, that these days they're very clear that they want it to be informed by Tuvaluan values, and to continuously recognise Tuvalu as a state, so they're not letting anyone kind of erode that, the fact, you know, the statehood, regardless of what happens to the land itself. So, and part of the Future Now project, which is on the right-hand side, involves planning for the digital Tuvalu, which you've probably heard about, but this is also about protecting culture, maritime borders and statehood, as I mentioned. So the overall policy is very clear that Tuvalu stands against relocation as a solution to the climate crisis. And yeah, what's interesting is that, you know, across government, civil society and activism, and, you know, everyday kind of people, it's very, how do I say it, similar, the position. So there's the separation between state and citizens in Tuvalu is very small, which makes for, I guess, a different kind of dynamic to what you'd see in big, very big countries. So this was a workshop that was organised by the Tuvalu civil society, but it also involved churches, community leaders and government representatives, as well as regional representatives. So some of the people in this photo are from regional organisations. One of them's Anouk Tong, who was the former president of Kiribati. So they had a major workshop in 2018. Again, came up with the conclusion that migration wouldn't happen unless it was absolutely necessary, and that there would be a commitment to staying put. And one of the commitments involved making the statement that we will reclaim our land from the oceans. And all of it was articulated in terms of Indigenous institutions and knowledge systems and values. There's also a wealth of scholarship coming out of places like Tuvalu. And that has occurred, you know, actually potentially in response to climate change, because back when I was first going to Tuvalu in about 2005, I don't think there was anyone in the country or any Tuvaluan anywhere who had a PhD, but now there are plenty, and many of them do their research on climate change issues in some capacity, typically social science and theology rather than science. So for people in Tuvalu, internal mobilities have long been a part of everyday life, since before colonisation, still today. And it's not just movement from the outer islands to the capital, it's also from the capital back to the outer islands. And sometimes this is a way of affirming culture and turning to customary practices in uncertain times, such as the pandemic. But just before the pandemic in 2019, I conducted a study in the rural island of Funafala, which is only accessible by boat, whose population is actually increasing, which is a bit surprising because it's remote. It has an unserviced village with no shops, no medical services or school, but was very appealing to both its existing and the new incoming residents because of the opportunities it afforded to engage in a more customary way of life away from the city. So this is like for the Indigenous people of the capital, it was an opportunity for them to get sort of back to a kind of more rural way of life. And people were actually choosing that and embracing it, even though it was actually quite difficult in terms of maybe just spending weekends there because they had to take the kids back to school during the week and things like that. But they really valued, being close to the land and sea, eating local food, going fishing, teaching their children these things. And this same kind of urban-rural migration happened on an even really big scale during the pandemic, because the key government recommendation at the beginning was for people to move from the capital back to the outer islands. And for most people, this meant moving to their whenua, the island of their family and ancestors, where customary land ownership and governance would ensure a share of subsistence resources, even if external imports became scarce or non-existent. And this kind of customary arrangements were built into the pandemic policy of relocation, voluntary relocation. So 25% of the capital did that. They voluntarily moved back to the rural islands of their families. And it was quite successful. Although more research needs to be done. They've only opened up the borders really in the last few months. So it'll be good to go back and see some of the changes that happened while the borders were closed for about 2 years. So one of the example of the practices is Farbotko, which is looking after your neighbour as if they're family. And this ensures everyone has access to food, shelter and water wherever they are and whoever they are. They don't have to be Tuvaluan, whether the challenge be, worker exploitation in New Zealand or a cyclone in Tuvalu or whatever it is. So I think it's actually quite interesting that Tuvalu was the only country in the world that was remaining essentially COVID-19 free and at the end of 2022 because the borders were closed for so long. And when finally community transmission occurred, most of the population was fully vaccinated. So it was a really successful pandemic story in Tuvalu, and it was quite unexpected. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, Tuvalu was ranked like almost last on the health vulnerability index, but they actually did pretty well, actually extremely well. But it also came down to this sort of, reliance on customary practices that the government kind of went, yep, that's what we're going to do to get through this pandemic, and it worked. So moving now a bit broader out into the wider Pacific, where some really exciting stuff is going on, many social movements that are, indigenizing climate change solutions, basically, and cannot attempt to try and cover them all here. In fact, I don't know about all of them, but one of them that I am familiar with is has its roots in the Pacific Theological College in Suva, which is seeking to centre the relational and spiritual ontologies of Pacific people. And the Reverend Dr. Apollo Lumavai, who is a Samoan theologian, is one of the central people in this eco-spiritual movement that recognises that land and people in many Pacific cultures is conceptualised as one and the same thing, and that sort of interconnections between people and nature, I guess. So the work that is being done in this eco-spiritual relationality is extremely comprehensive. It involves, the sort of goals of re-educating the entire development ecosystem in the Pacific, for example, and a decolonisation, basically, of the entire climate change agenda. And so I can hardly do justice to it here, and I'm still very much a beginner student of this Pacific relationality approach. And I'm very much looking forward to attending a 2-week intensive residential course next month in Suva that's being run by this Pacific Theological College to learn much more about it. But another initiative of the Pacific Theological College is the Institute for Climate Indigenous Knowledge, which is headed by Tafui Lasama, who is a Tuvaluan theologian also, who I mentioned earlier. And one of the aims of this institute is to feed Indigenous knowledge directly into the national and international climate and development policies that affect Pacific people, thereby bypassing that sort of standard external consultant model that a lot of Pacific people are kind of fed up with. So one of the most important aspects of centering relationality is that we are asked to think about the relational security of people of the Pacific in a changing climate. And the eco-spiritual relationality perspective actually sees this, this external kind of determination of climate change solutions to be an even greater threat to relational security than climate change impacts themselves. So at this stage, I'll return to a time before European colonisation, briefly, when the Pacific was never a static realm of isolated islands. It was always about oceanic voyaging. The ancestors of the Pacific Island people were the first globally to navigate out of sight of land. And I've always been struck by this as this profound achievement in social and technological history. Ever since I was privileged to hear a master navigator named Nonoa Thompson from Hawaii speak about these issues. So when navigating out of sight of land for the first time in human history, these Pacific Ocean navigators conceived of themselves as centered and still in an ever-expanding universe. So while the navigator is still, the navigators and the canoe is still, it's like the world, the cosmos around it, it's moving. Ocean and stars are mobile, land moves from absence over the horizon towards the canoe, or the waka, as they are called in most Pacific languages. And so movement and change of the world itself, and this defines mobility in a completely different way to what a Eurocentric conceptualization would do, which is often assumed to apply universally, where the human body is the entity that is moving. So when I heard Master Navigator Nonoa Thompson speak about this, it was so powerful because he told about how it revitalized the revitalization of ancient navigational knowledge was a kind of a vital way in which the people of Hawaii, and also in other places of the Pacific, because the movement kind of spread around, it helped people heal from the kind of different colonial violences and injustices that they had been experiencing throughout colonization. So this kind of mobility of Pacific people is always kind of like in the back of my mind when I'm doing this work, because even though a lot of these navigational skills have been lost, there's something about that stillness in a moving cosmos in the canoe that I feel is still part of Pacific cultures, or many Pacific cultures anyway, that have ocean-going navigational histories. So obviously back to the present now. This happened in 2014 in Newcastle, Australia, which is the site of one of the world's largest coal ports. The Pacific Climate Warriors paddled out in traditional canoes and kayaks they had built and shipped over from the islands to stage a blockade on the coal industry. And they successfully prevented 2 coal ships from passing through the port that day. And each activist clearly is dressed in the ceremonial attire of their homeland. They came from a range of Pacific islands. But the canoe, as this sort of central feature of climate change activism, sort of with the coal ships, but also with the history of oceanic voyaging being kind of stopped during colonized times, it just sort of reminds us of climate change is only, the most recent of layers of colonialism in Pacific lives. But there's always these ongoing attempts to reclaim the oceanic spaciousness that Pacific worlds were once kind of constituted in. So I see the Pacific Climate Warriors as sort of navigating their canoe journeys towards this self-determined post-carbon futures. And And it's almost irrelevant whether the land they are headed to, I think, is reclaimed or not. But it's rather this sort of Pacific Indigenous mobilities of islands moving towards the canoe that may be quite helpful in, shifting the narrative away from that disappearing island. So this is the Polynesian Voyaging Society that's doing amazing journeys of awareness raising and education on how looking after the earth can be done differently, drawing on Pacific Indigenous knowledge and culture. So it seems to me that if we're looking for relational security as the kind of something that the Pacific Island people are sort of looking to achieve in this kind of changing climate world, that you can look to the ancient navigators venturing out into the new world, being out of sight of land. That's one way of looking at relational security, but it may have also been achieved in Newcastle Harbour because the youth of the Pacific were, relearning how to build canoes from their elders to directly prevent coal being moved through a port, and, really in a really kind of material, physical way, like literally blocking the enormous challenge of climate change through the kind of coal ships. So this idea of being master navigators and being still in a moving cosmos can still be a way, maybe, for people of the Pacific to be secure in their sea of islands. But Pacific people are now also looking to the earth and its people as relational and connected through these ideas of voyaging and care. And this I see as a alternative way of thinking about climate mobility in the Pacific that would potentially benefit from greater visibility and understanding when it comes to the international organizations who insist that they're about to disappear. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. I'm going to spotlight you here. So let's see here. All righty. Thank you so much for that. Really important here that, and we're really valuing this conversation around narrative shifts, both in research and also in possibility. So this was really tremendous. Yes, I'm echoing Romy in the chat. Really a joy to hear. I want to give everyone the opportunity to be able to ask some questions. And so if folks want to populate the chat with any questions, I'm happy to read it. Or if you want to go ahead and raise your hand, I'm happy to call on you. Just to start off the conversation, maybe, Carol, I'm happy to kind of start that conversation off with some questions. But I really appreciate both the conversations that you've been having and trying to amplify both with narrative shifts, but also this tension between how within the context of the climate mobility space, the conversations about adaptation often get left off. So in my own work, I've been talking about how, for example, in an international governance regime, kind of shoving the climate mobilities issue merely into the loss and damage kind of pillar really loses the fact that within the context of the spectrum of mobilities is in situ adaptation and the need for the kind of investment in these various different forms. So I really like, and I find it really helpful, your concept of voluntary immobility. I was wondering on that, in terms of international governance, is there any kind of, if you could share any concerted ways in which both this shift and investment into Indigenous knowledge ways for local adaptation is also finding purchase about financing mechanisms that can be led, by communities themselves, but on the international scheme. So if you're not working within the context of a framework of, let's say, the L&D pillar or something like that, has there been any sort of attempts to say hey, this is part of the obligations to addressing this issue is not merely maybe issues of facilitating migration through work visas and all this sort of thing. That seems to be, some of the dominant approaches, but really in looking about redirecting funds without recognizing that fund redistribution, like in an L&D scheme, is about the sort of inevitable uninhabitability of these kinds of efforts. So it seems like there's, that tension that needs to get kind of pulled out. I know there's a lot of kind of wiggle room right now with how to understand the distinction between loss and damage and adaptation, but I was wondering if those conversations are happening in particular in the Pacific, or if they're not really that salient.
Oh, they certainly are. Yeah, I mean, there's I think maybe that the tension is being played out every day. I mean, there's if you go to Suva, where a lot of the sort of regional organizations are these days, they're mostly staffed by Pacific people who have come up, particularly young ones in the last 20 years with a different kind of more decolonized education than maybe their parents had. And so they're grappling, with being, these amazing young, innovative, highly educated Pacific Islanders who know how, know their communities, they know their stuff about climate change, and yet they're sort of still locked into these sort of UN kind of approaches and international approaches, and still to a certain extent have to deal with, the ideas of external kind of people. And that, to be honest, the loss and damage and financing stuff is not my area. But I do see, I know people who work in these kind of organizations, and I do see that they do kind of have to try and navigate that sort of two worlds somehow. But places like the Pacific Theological College are doing that in a really practical way. So, for instance, this course that I'm going to in a couple of weeks will be in partnership with some of the regional development organizations. So there will be having to start, I think, really taking this more indigenized approach seriously. And, what that means for something like loss and damage, I think remains to be seen. But I don't think the momentum is going to slow down. So I think that, that kind of, that overarching umbrella kind of global approach will have to be, they will have to take into account what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, no, it seems that there's this, tension between, at least with the L&D stuff, but of it being like a hard-won battle to have it recognized as a particular climate pillar, but then at the same time, the closing of the opportunities of reframing some of these issues as like ongoing adaptation schemes and things like that. So, so it's good to hear that hopefully there'll be a continuing amplifying of these ideas all the way through those kinds of mechanisms. I don't want to take up too much question space. We have about a half hour or so. So do folks want to, you could go ahead and raise a hand. So I see Colin's hand first. So if you want to go ahead and unmute.
I can definitely ask, but I also don't, if other people want to jump in earlier, it's fine. I'm in no rush. Thanks so much, Carol. This is really great and interesting. I don't exactly know how to phrase this question, but a lot of what you said got me thinking in a bunch of interesting ways. I'm going to say some things, and I wonder if any of it is useful, or if you can help reflect on it, or help me reflect on it or anything. So I'm in the Netherlands right now. I'm in Amsterdam, and it's of course a country that has a huge percentage of the land that's underwater. The narratives are completely different in all sorts of ways, right? And for all sorts of reasons. But one of the things that is interesting when I was sort of hearing you talk about the re-emplacement and so, like, some of the strategies for reclaiming land, for making it livable, for in situ adaptation, end up, at least on certain models, being like quite, like engineering heavy, industrial heavy, like a lot about sort of manipulation of land, of nature, of the environment. And my impression is that over here, which there's a model of adaptation, a model of controlling water that has always been, there's a saying in the Netherlands that it's something like, God made the earth and the Dutch made the Netherlands, because the land is so engineered. but it really has shaped the conception of like nature, of how people relate to whatever Dutch nature is. And this, of course, is a huge thing when you're thinking of a cosmology, of an ontology, of a relational identity with a land, with an island, with an ocean, with even the sort of the mobility voyage stuff. So I remember a long time ago now, I read a little bit about Noah Thompson and Mau Pialug and the sort of Hokulea stuff, and it was so deeply fascinating. But the more you start sort of manipulating, I think, land to make it, to engineer the land, it starts changing what it is, qua nature, qua relationship, qua life. And so I'm curious how, in your experience, like that aspect of navigating the identity plus some of the technical or engineering stuff that you have to do in order to do some in situ adaptation, like how those either can inform each other or intention, connect, relate. Like maybe, I've seen, kind of what I'm getting at, even though I can't really put it the way that I think I want to.
Yeah, I mean, that it's that sort of trade-off, isn't it? That you either have this highly engineered kind of land, or you have potentially nothing. And there's no like, ideal kind of way in which you can do those engineering solutions without, like you say, making these kind of major sort of shifts in the way people would interact with the environment. So that all remains to be seen in places like Tuvalu. Like, I like your example of the Netherlands, that has been happening for hundreds of years. But, in the Netherlands, there is, like, I guess, a commitment to this kind of living, and there always has been. And, there is a sense of place there. There is a real sense of what, the Netherlands is a distinct place with a distinct people and a distinct culture. And I think that's something that people in Tuvalu, for instance, would be, happy to see that is possible, even if it's not the best possible solution. And there's all sorts of, issues like loss of local ecosystems and loss of sense of place initially when you have, these big engineered new structures. I mean, even the new land reclamation on small scale on Funafuti is quite sort of different to the rest of the island. And I've seen it in person. There's also all sorts of issues around who will get ownership of the new land, how that relates to customary land arrangements, how that might, people who have lost parts of their land would start to claim the new land. And, there's so many complex issues, as there is, I guess, on any land anywhere. But I still think that it's better to have, like, I don't know how much you know about the history of Tuvalu, but they sought independence from Kiribati when the British really wanted them to stay together with Kiribati, because of their unique cultural identity. They didn't want to be kind of overwhelmed by the larger Kiribati population and feel dominated by them politically forever. And it was worth having very little because the British didn't give them anything, because they didn't want this Tuvalu to be separate from Kiribati. So Kiribati got all the resources at independence, and Tuvalu got pretty much nothing. But that was kind of like the trade-off they were willing to take to be Tuvaluans, not part of Kiribati. So, it's that same kind of trade-off. Do you want to just be a diaspora group in Australia or New Zealand or Fiji, or do you want to have your own self-determination? Yeah, it seems like they're coming down on that heavily engineered solution side.
Yeah, I mean, and are there really active ways of trying to navigate that? So like that's been a better, you know, sort of crystallizing as a better alternative, but also like sort of really trying to because there's the different time horizons are part of the things that are interesting here of like how culture evolves over a bunch of time versus these sort of like immediate changes that need to happen or whatever. And that's also part of like the weird compression in I think the narratives is you have like crisis scenarios over hundreds and hundreds of years versus family planning or a government policy planning or whatever. And like the way time is used ends up messing up sort of how these narratives get shaped or operationalized. But just even like sort of knowing that some of these costs are coming, how to preserve the sort of like traditional Tuvaluan way of life, right? Because the traditional sort of Dutch way of life was a version of this kind of like technocratic, highly engineered thing, which I'm not sure is true. And so then it's more of a sort of switch when you then end up taking that cost to do it. And so, yeah, I mean, it's not a question for you to answer. I'm just like really curious about what forms and strategies local, you know, people and communities can do to try to sort of like take that, which is better than a version of relocation to Australia, but then also like resist some of the creeping technocratic, highly engineered kind of thing that can dissolve over a long timeline, a cultural identity or something. Anyway, I'll stop. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Colin. So I'm going to read a question in the chat, and then I have Manasa and Holly next. So Serena's asking in the chat, Carol, thanks to you for sharing all of this work, and said that the beach nourishment was one adaptation approach. Any traditional approaches that you can share, floating or raised homes, or any other strategies? Also, are seasonal trips aligned with natural cycles typical?
Yeah, I mean, at a household scale, the traditional approaches to adaptation are really common. So in Funafala, there was, you know, homemade seawalls and, you know, local mangrove plantations. There are screens that people make from coconut leaves to protect against wind. Rubbish or waste is used along the shore to protect against erosion. So lots of small scale traditional approaches for sure. In terms of, yeah, floating and raised homes, I haven't seen that in the capital, maybe in the outer islands, or I'm hoping to go. I haven't been for a long time, hoping to go soon. So these kind of things, yeah, could be happening. Seasonal trips, I know that happened more, you know, before kind of World War II. So people would move around different islets on their island, on their atoll, for different crops, access and things like that to replenish. You know, the coconuts were used up in an area, then the families would move to a different part of the island. Things like that was very common. That's not so common these days, where, you know, there's a central village, more non-traditional houses which are very hard to move, things like that. So, you know, obviously there's a mixture. But yeah, I know that there are, this is getting a bit beyond my expertise because I'm not real good on the physical geography, but I know there are traditional methods of actually, like, you know, dealing with things like how because atolls are dynamic kind of systems, not static, that, you know, when parts of the atoll kind of move, that there are traditional ways of actually managing that, so that land is not too much lost and things like that. But that's getting a little bit beyond my expertise.
All right, so Manasa, Holly, and then I see Sam. So
thanks, Simona. Thank you, Dr. Farbotko. This was like fantastic. You rarely hear about these perspectives. And I just defended my thesis on climate migration and security perspectives around it from the global West. So one of the sort of something I learned during my research was Kiribati's changing strategy on climate migration or climate mobility. While the former president had this entire plan about migration with dignity and the right to relocate, which was, again, it had its own drawbacks, the current president has completely scrapped that plan, removed any archival information as well, and his plan is now to sort of stay and fight. But it's also sort of mixed in with this both indigenous sort of mythologies, but also Christian narratives on if God didn't want us to stay, he wouldn't have put us on this island, or there's a divine hand at play, and so on. So I was wondering if, and obviously this has geopolitical implications. They, stepped out of the Pacific Island Forum, Chinese involvement, et cetera. But I was wondering if this has any sort of parallels with Tuvalu, or there's any conversations between the different island nations on how to address this sort of, I know climate adaptation is spoken about within the Pacific Island Forum bodies, but at a regional level, is there any sort of cohesive approach or cooperative approach to addressing this? And what does a sort of Kiribati's sort of approach to this situation, how does that sort of impact the other island states, particularly, I think, Tuvalu? I think that was my question. I mean, you don't have to answer it, just the discussion.
Yeah, look, to be honest, I don't know everything about what's going on with Kiribati, but you're right. I mean, the migration with dignity policy was very much kind of shifted away from around 2016. But I always saw the migration with dignity policy as about not so much a relocation kind of strategy as an enabler of economic migration, so that people would then have a choice whether they wanted to move or not. And if they did move, they'd have the sort of skills that would be desirable in the global economy. But then also that if they say it went to study abroad, that they could bring the skills back to Kiribati. So it was not seen as like the whole country moving, but to enable new forms of climate mobility that would enable both resilience at home as well as abroad, with the long-term view of potentially, maybe the whole country needing to relocate at some point, and that there would be a good Kiribati diaspora out there to help make that a smooth process. So it was never really just about, a simple relocation. So that's one thing. And that, Kiribati labour mobility has not stopped. It's still going, and there's still Kiribati workers going to Australia and New Zealand and doing exactly what the migration dignity policy wanted. Although I should also say that there was an excellent program a long time ago now that the Australian government and the Kiribati government came up with back in like 2008 or something, quite a long time ago. And it was very short-lived, but it was very successful nursing training initiative, where a whole lot of Kiribati students came over to study nursing at Griffith University, actually, where I am. And they had the option, obviously, to move back to Kiribati or to stay in Australia as nurses, trained nurses. Both countries would win because Australia is short of nurses, Kiribati is short of nurses. And, by sort of every evaluation, it was deemed to be really successful. The only problem was it was quite costly to the Australian government, so it was never replicated. But those kind of climate mobility schemes where training and education is like central, probably better than these like unskilled kind of opportunities. So yeah, there's lots of complexity in the Kiribati example. To be honest, I think, discussion between Tuvalu and Kiribati on these issues is, maybe it happens, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I mean, I'm sure you've heard of the regional framework on climate mobility that's happening in the Pacific. So obviously there's discussion at the regional level with all states included in that, including Kiribati, I think. So and that hasn't come up with any sort of really major initiatives, apart from, I think someone said, better rights for labour workers and international workers and things like that. yeah, so I probably can't tell you much more than you already know.
No, that's okay. This is good to know as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Manasa. Holly, and then Sam.
Thank you so much for your talk and for everyone's questions. I have to preface this with, I'm not from your area of research at all. I'm a neuroscientist, and I work at I'm in Washington, DC right now, where I work in the National Institute of Mental Health at NIH. And the research I support has to do with mobility, and I'm here to learn about climate and the mobility and mental health that is. So I really appreciated your perspectives, and I have one question and a comment. And I said all of this because I'm afraid my question's stupid. So with regard to the notion of being the center of the world and having the universe move around you, I found fascinating. It's the opposite of what we know about how the brain works. And I was just wondering, do you know of other cultures that have that perspective as well, and where they might be? And do you want to answer that, and then I can or however you want to do it? Yeah.
Sure. Look, that's a really good question, and I don't know. I haven't read about it in the context of other cultures, but maybe I should. So it's a really good question, and I'm afraid I don't know the answer, but please carry on.
Okay, thank you. And the other thing that fascinated me about your talk is the notion of adaptation. And that's also a notion in mental health in this scenario when people are on the move. So people always think PTSD, depression, blah, blah, blah. But most people are resilient in these situations from a statistical perspective. And I just found, I'm wondering whether or not how those relate to each other, the adaptation that you all are talking about and the resilience in the biology of people. So that's something I found interesting. I don't know if you have a thought on that. Thank you.
Yeah, also very, very interesting question. I mean, I guess adaptation, for geographers is often about something external to the to the self or to the psychology, although not always. I mean, there is this idea that that we have to behave differently to adapt to climate change. So yeah, and I mean, I think to maybe extend, and you could probably answer this much better than I am, but I'm guessing that whether people stay or whether they move, there will be pretty good levels of resilience for many. So is the question really about moving or not when it comes to, I guess, psychological well-being? But I conceptualize this as more, in the Pacific context at least, this idea of kind of more collective and social well-being that's going to be more affected. That because of this intricate relation between, not just between people, but also between the land and the environment and the sea, that there's more damage done if people have to move away from those things permanently. And it's hard to recreate that kind of those kind of social bonds and those kind of cultural forms of resilience, social forms of resilience in a new place. Some of it's there, but not all of it, especially when you're taken away from this like kind of spiritual, ancestral connection to a place. So it depends also whether you see it as like a collective thing or as an individual thing. And I think in the context of the Pacific, with collective kind of societies being so important, the individual is not necessarily the unit at which we need to think about well-being, I guess. At least that's what a Pacific eco-relationality perspective that I discussed would say.
Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. Sam.
Thanks so much. This has been a really fascinating talk, and I feel like I've learned a great deal from it, as indeed I have already from your articles. So thanks for coming and speaking. I'm a researcher at the Centre for Global Development, and we've recently been looking at climate change and migration in some depth. And one of the things that we also look at is the question of climate finance and where the adaptation money for different projects is going to come from. And so it's been very interesting to hear you talking about the desire of Tuvaluans and of other Pacific Islanders to reclaim the rights to decide where they are, how they live in community, and all of the other details in which the discussion of climate and mobility is bound up. But I was wondering whether you could comment on the fact that, of course, at the end of the day, whether they are able to stay, whether they are able to raise the large amount of land that they need to above sea level, is contingent on outside actors deciding where to put their money. Would you be able to speak about how that relationship, how the need to convince other people with other perceptions of priorities, kind of utilitarian ethics, as opposed to a community-based ethics, is perceived within Tuvaluan discourse on this subject? Thank you very much.
I mean, that's exactly the problem as I see it, that, you know, the money is all seems to be more important than, you know, the right to self-determination, for instance. So and you're right. I mean, if external actors are making the decisions about funding, then it is extremely worrying, I guess, for exactly this issue. So I think it's just important to keep remembering, you know, what would we do if it was the Netherlands? Like, the Netherlands could potentially fund its own adaptation, but if they couldn't, what would the international community do? You know, like they would
certainly get a lot more help from the EU than I think Tuvalu is going to be getting.
Yeah, like there's certain expectations. There's always been expectations about these islands long before climate change came in to the picture, about them being, you know, very peripheral, vulnerable, on the edge of not being habitable anyway, right? This discourse does not just start with climate change. And there's been some really good work done on this by someone called Charlotte Weatherall recently. So she's tracked all that vulnerability discourse, you know, right back and through to climate change. And, you know, it's like first the colonization, and then this, you know, oh, you're never going to make it as an independent state. You're too small. You've got no resources, you know. So there's always been this struggle to, you know, be legitimate states and legitimate kind of places even that are worthy of human habitation. And just because you know, a few Western, I don't know, people went there and thought it was a really hard place to live at one point, that discourse kind of stuck. And, you know, the people that did live there were kind of belittled for just eating coconuts and fish, but they see it as being, you know, a wonderful opportunity to live close to nature and to be self-reliant. And, you know, so it's just this completely different perspective on what these places are. And yeah, I guess that's what I try and do, is just keep trying to shift this narrative a bit and just sort of, you know, expose some of these assumptions. But there's some powerful forces at work, and people that have the money have different ideas, I guess. So it's worrying.
Maybe I'll follow up on the climate financing. I mean, you know, the Bridgetown Initiative hopefully seems to be getting a bit more support, which is looking at how to restructure different, you know, global financial systems, and hopefully redirect funding in that way. Has that come up at all as a kind of mechanism to jump on board with, or try to push forward the kind of work that's been emerging out of Barbados and you know, debt relationships between debt refinancing, that sort of thing? Or in the Pacific, is it a little less salient?
A little less, but yeah, once again, it's climate finance tends to do my head in. So.
Yeah. it's not
Probably
ideal.
not the best person to comment on it. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was like, you know, in conversations, if a lot of it ends up being a sort of in the pursuit of self-determination, that this isn't something that we're going to be able to resolve as a regional, you know, or as a people's, or you were mentioning later starting to see the kind of connections between some of these different kinds of narratives across different peoples, as opposed to then seeing it as a entering into the sort of normative infrastructure that's already, you know, in place, or some of the shifting finances. So I didn't know if any conversations in part about how to fund these certain kinds of things seem much more about like self-reliance or building connections within the region as opposed to on the international scale.
Yeah, no, I think it's still very much, you know, that there's an awareness of the big players, and that you need to
Play ball.
play the game as its rules are set by outsiders. I think, yeah. But as I've said, this is being chipped away at. So yeah, I think things will continually sort of change on that front.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to give an opportunity for anyone else that maybe in the conversations that have come up, if anyone has any more questions. All right, well, Carol, I want to let you be able to go to sleep. And then also thank you tremendously for your work, and also for amplifying the work of all the important things that are happening right now on the ground. I think we've talked a lot about how to bring a kind of shared community together on some of these things. So I might follow up to see if there's ways that we can help to bring folks in the spring that you're working with to Princeton possibly. And because we're looking at this really like, you know, power sharing in terms of the way even academic conferences should be structured, and the ways that we should be even starting to pose research questions and things like that. So maybe expect a follow-up from us about us being able to hopefully finance and bring some folks over and be able to continue to share their work. But if you want to send us also readings and resources, I'm happy to distribute that to the group as well. But in
Thanks
general,
so much.
thank
That
you so
sounds
much.
amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, will do. I'll be in touch with you very soon on that sort of hopeful collaboration. So with that, I want to thank you so much for your own research. Your work is so important and keeps on giving, honestly, for all of us that are working in this space. So we really appreciate it. And to everyone who's been coming all semester, thank you so much for your great questions and your participation. My email inbox is open, so stay tuned for hopefully more opportunities in this kind of intellectual and collaborative and productive and hopefully practice-based space as well going forward. So Carol, have a wonderful night. Everybody else, evening, morning, rest of your day. Stay safe and healthy, and we will see you soon. Thanks so much, everybody.